Will you make comments on the? Thank you. Will you make comments on the current problem of double the deficit of the U.S., the trade deficit and the budget deficit? Many people are saying that it is not sustainable. It's been said for the last 10 or 20 years, but there might be some limits. So.
Yes, you are right. I mean, it's more than 10 years now that the deficit is supposedly non-sustainable. And why is it sustainable? It is sustainable, first of all, because the US economy is growing. And in a growing economy, to finance the public deficit is not a problem. And the relationship between the public sector deficit and the US economy is very small. So it's not a real economic challenge, it's more of a political challenge. And the deficit is more used as a political instrument to say, look, you are unable to manage the state resources. But in fact, in economic terms, I mean, the deficit is only a problem in the economy, as you know, if it's financed by inflation. Okay? Then the deficit is a problem. But in the US, it's not financed by inflation, it's financed by credit. This credit is very reliable. So people would say, yes, but it's financed by credit borrowed abroad. What if the Russians, the Chinese, the Koreans, the Japanese take their money out of the United States? Well, they could do that theoretically. They could do that. But they know that if they do that, they would commit kind of a suicide. And because they would be the first victims of the bankruptcy of the US system. And we are in a period, we are happily in a period where central bank leaders and government in major countries are quite well enlightened. Everybody now at the head of major countries, they know how the economy works. In the case of China, and also the Arab countries who lend a lot of money to the US, they know what they do. They lend money to the US because it's a safe investment. It's the safest investment on earth. Even if it's not profitable, it's safe. And what people are looking for is safety. So I see no risk why the money suddenly would leave the United States and shift to another currency. Where would they go? Where would they go? They have nowhere to go. And so there is, the system is stable, and I think it can be predicted as stable. Now for the exchange deficit, it's a little bit the same story. The budget deficit is a great exchange balance deficit is the great advantage for the rest of the world. It's because of this deficit that China is booming. Because the US consumers are buying too many, as some say, too many Chinese goods or too many Korean goods or too many Indian goods. This is why these countries are booming. So everybody is happy with this kind of deal. For the US consumers, life is cheap. And for the Chinese producers, life is good. And everybody knows how this trade-off works. And once again, you have people advocating the trouble ahead. What happens if there is a panic? Well, if there is a panic, the dollar will go down, which is happening right now, and the US will export more. And that would be very bad for the Chinese. So everybody is interdependent. And the twin deficits are only a traduction of this interdependence. It shows that the cycle is closed. It shows how all these countries are dependent on the leading nation. And the leading nation must have a deficit, because it is through the deficit that it can act as an engine of export for developing countries.
Okay. Any other questions, comments? Yes, definitely.
I really enjoyed your presentation this morning. My question is very simple. You compared United States with EU in terms of economic dynamism and competitiveness. And you also mentioned that there is an unavoidable trade-off between welfare and economic growth.
Yes.
Then my question is, assuming if you are born now,
Yes.
and you are completely free to choose your citizenship, which would you choose? That's my question.
Yes. It's a very good question because young people tend to choose. Young people would prefer the US system because they are young. But when you are not young anymore, of course you prefer the European system. And when you are, let's say, when you are entering into your 60s, the European system is perfect because your children will pay for you. And but my children are not very happy knowing that they will pay for me. And but demographic is a very important explanation factor. It's when the population grows older, the balance, the political balance, goes toward the elder people, and therefore the political, the government looks at where is the majority, and the majority being older. So the government will tend to give more satisfaction to the older people. They have a very good healthcare and pension system. So the demographic all over Western Europe, as you know, it's an increase in the number percentage of older people. And this is not very good for younger people, because this choice in favor of welfare versus economic dynamism has negative consequences for the younger people. It's more and more difficult for them to find a job. More and more difficult to find a job. So there again, it's a trade-off. That's a problem with economics. Always a question of trade-off. No system is perfect. When people criticize the United States or criticize Europe, they say Europe is not dynamic enough. Okay, we made a trade-off in favor of welfare. Other people will criticize the United States, say, oh look, no welfare, no national insurance for everybody. Okay, but you have economic dynamism. You know, economic science works that way. You have to choose between the less bad solutions.
Yes.
먼저 이 오늘 우연한 방문 시에 제 미국에서 살고 있습니다. 올려서 저기 이원당 덕분에 이런 좋은 모임에 참석해서 아주 참 유익한 맛도 있고 제 측에 우선 이런 귀한 모임에 감사드립니다. And I have one comment to Mr. Sorman. I've been living in the States over 40 years. I just happened to visit my home country, history, and I'm very fortunate to be present in your presentation this morning. I cannot agree more than what you mentioned about the strength and high points that you pointed out. And I might add just one more important element based on my personal experience living in the States over 40 years. The tolerance, the economic tolerance of America. It goes for individual level as well as institutional level. I think that's a rarely seen, let's say, phenomenon. We can only see in the United States. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good. Any other comments or questions? Yes. Yes. Senator Charles.
I understand that many French people, they don't like to speak English. Maybe they don't like the country US itself. But this morning you said US economy will continue to be very good in the 21st century. Besides this strong US economy, is there any other reasons for you to like to speak in English and to like the country?
Well, I'm afraid that if I can speak French, the ambassador confirms. But you know, the French people would love that French would be the global language, but it is not. And so our attitude and I speak under the control of the ambassador. There was a time when French speakers were invited to speak only French. And now we understand more and more, even in the cultural circles, that what's important is not the language, it's the content. So it's better to have people understand you because you speak English that do not understand because you speak French. And so many French politicians, intellectuals, academics have decided to choose English because it's a global language. And English doesn't belong to a specific nation anymore. When you go to India, for example, people consider that English is their language. And the Indians very often say, well, these poor British, they are a minority now. And they have this strange British accent. So it has become a global language, and I think that's very good. I think it's very good in terms of human exchanges. We can speak, we can communicate through internet. We know that we will be more or less understood everywhere over the planet. So I think it's a huge human and economic and cultural advantage in terms of peace and prosperity to be able to communicate. So English is an instrument of communication. Now the attitude of the French vis-à-vis the United States, it's a very old story, and I'll make one distinction. Most of the French people like the United States. They are fascinated by American culture. They like to go there for vacation, and if they can, they like to study there. So they like the United States. And we were allies during major wars, so there is no major conflict between the US and France. But there's another phenomenon, which is anti-Americanism. And anti-Americanism is kind of an intellectual or political industry, which is producing books, rhetorics, political behaviors, and columns in the newspapers. But this industry is distinct from the United States as a real nation. So we have to make this distinction. And you have to look at anti-Americanism as an ideology as such. And sometime I said that even if the US did not exist, still you would have anti-Americanism as an industry.
That's very good. While people are pondering, let me again. Last time over dinner we talked about the French politics today. You have a new president, Mr. Sarkozy, who is committed to have more market-oriented reform and labor market flexibility and so forth, and which again happened under the leadership of Merkel in Germany. So in a way, the major European two economies are adapting, or at least try to adopt some of the merits of Anglo-Saxon market-oriented private economy. Now, the French people and the Germans, I suppose, are so used to more state-dominated socialistic economic system, and all this very benevolent social welfare and everything else. And how do you see the Sarkozy's the probability of success in implementing all of these policies? And in this regard, now Dr. Lee asked a very interesting question: whether you're born today, whether you adopt French model, the European model, or but I think when you ask that question, I think we have to be more careful about the current level of per capita income. In case of Korea, for example, the reason why I say this is that many people say, well, European system is good, but the question is, Korean people, the question is whether they are willing to pay that much tax. And our per capita income level is not high enough. We have a long way to go. If you're already over 40,000 or 35,000 per capita income level, and you can afford to pay the good welfare system, but we just cannot afford it. If we go for that model, then our economy will not grow and strong enough. So we may not ever reach the level where the European economies are today. So I think Koreans have to learn a lot of lessons from the French and the German experience. And even they are trying to change the course of their economic policy directions. And so I'm very much interested in the Sarkozy's reform paper. What's your view on this?
Yes. I think what is very well understood now, and there is a consensus between all economists and government, that you have a direct relationship between tax and growth. If you have higher tax, you have small growth. And there is a direct relation between public expenditure and the dynamism of an economy. When I say this, it was not so evident 30 years ago, for example, when the most leading economists were still in the Keynesian tradition, and they thought by increasing public spending, you were creating consumer demand. This doesn't work. It doesn't work theoretically, it has been tried, it failed. So now it's evident and sure and granted that the level of taxation is the absolute condition of your level of growth. So what Sarkozy is trying to do, and what Schröder did before Mrs. Merkel, is to try to reduce the level of taxation in order to increase productivity. The problem is that you cannot go very far. You cannot go very far because people protect their interest. And as France is a rather old nation demographically, as I said before, the limit is a political limit. You can reduce welfare by reducing taxes to a certain extent, but you cannot reduce taxes without reducing welfare. I mean, everything is connected. So probably what Sarkozy will do, and what the German government did, is to try to shift a little bit the balance, and to have a little bit less of welfare and a little bit more of economic dynamism. But we will not shift from a European system to an American system. You can just move the line. It's enough sometime. In the case of Germany, before the reforms were implemented, the growth rate in Germany was 1.8%. Now it's 2.3%. It's a 0.5% growth more. From a Korean perspective, where you are accustomed to very high growth rate, it looks ridiculous. But for us, 0.5% makes a big difference, because we are already very rich. And if you increase your growth rate by 0.5%, that means that you will reduce unemployment by half in 1 year, which the Germans are doing. So it's only through this kind of a modest reform and shift within the system, but not by changing the system, that we can make the system more sustainable without creating a revolution. To summarize, all Western governments agree on the diagnosis. That's very important. There is a consensus on what works and what doesn't work. As you say, in the case of Korea, if you increase taxes, you'll destroy growth. Okay? In France, if we reduce taxes, we'll destroy the welfare system, the people will revolt. So the diagnosis is clear. The solutions are very complicated because you are in a sophisticated political environment where you have to keep your constituency, the people who voted for you, and you must avoid revolt from the rest of the population. But in the case of France, for the first time since many years, we are going in the direction of a modest supply-side revolution. And finally, as I mentioned before, in the case of the United States, and I do insist very much in France on this, and I've repeatedly said to President Sarkozy, we must invest much more in our higher education system. Our higher education system is not at the level. It's free, but there is nothing at a free lunch. It's free, it's not efficient, it's not competitive. So we have to introduce free market reforms and privatization within the higher education sector, because this is the only way, to remain among the leading nation in the future.
Okay. Yes. Thank you very much, Dr. Sorman, for your eye-opening lecture. I have a question about the Chinese economy. Size of China's GDP is now taking third place in the world, and many economic forecasts say that the Chinese economy, in terms of size of GDP, will become the largest maybe year 2030 or 2040. What do you think will happen to the economic leadership of China and U.S.? And I also want to remind you that China's economic size was the largest by, say, 17th century. And when China's economy size becomes the largest in the world, then what will happen to U.S. The superpower status? What will happen to it?
Size means only size, and to be big doesn't mean to be strong, and to be fat doesn't mean that you are fast. And I say that so far, of course, it's increasing in volume, but I'm not fascinated so far by the innovation capacity of the Chinese economy. And I wait until the day when the Chinese would overcome other countries like Korea, Japan, or Western Europe and the US in terms of innovation or brand creations. How many brands are global brands made in China? None. Much is said about the investment in China in the higher education system. Well, again, it's a question of size. They have huge universities. The quality of these universities is not yet at a global level. The Chinese are the first to admit it. When they need to build the equipment for the Olympic Games in Beijing, they ask architects from the UK, Europe, United States, and foreign engineers, because they know that they confess, and you can understand, that their own engineers and architects are not yet at the level of the global competition. So to put size first, I think in terms of economic is not very significant. And also there are some major problems which China really has not solved. The first one is how to have the whole population joining the economic dynamism of China. As you know, this is not the case today. The gap, economic gap and social gap between rural China and urban China is frightening and increasing by the day. The Chinese government is investing mostly in the industries directed toward export, because this is more productive in terms of currency. But they don't invest very much in schools, they don't invest very much in healthcare, and it is as if they forgot that 80% of the Chinese people are not part of this dynamism. So they have this huge social problem. And they have, as I said before, the huge political problem. They have no institution as such. And they have no financial institution, they have no legal property right, there are no institutions. So they totally depend on the legitimacy of the Communist Party and the enlightened leaders which they have right at the moment. So there are so many sources of uncertainty that I'm very cautious in making any prediction concerning China. And once again, if you consider that innovation is the leading engine of growth, China so far is much behind. And once again, when I say that, it's not China bashing. I'm very, I knew China 40 years ago as a very poor country destroyed by civil war. I see China now as a relatively safe and quiet country with hope for the people for the first time since centuries. This is very good. It's a source of happiness for everybody. Okay? So no China bashing, but no exaggeration and no confusion between size and economic dynamism, which are two different factors.
Okay, Minister Lee.
Thank you very much for your.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much for your insightful analysis. I would like to invite your view about U.S. capability to create or change the rule of global economic game. What I mean is, I think this is another important factor which contributed to U.S. power. For example, in the 1940s, they created the Bretton Woods system, and in the 1970s, they actually changed the rule of global monetary system by moving from fixed exchange rate system to a floating exchange rate system. In the 1980s, they globalized the international financial system. So each time they could change the rule of the game. Do you think they still have that kind of capability to change or create the rule of the global economic game in this deepening, in this period of deepening globalization?
Yes, it's a very important remark that you make. If you look at the two fundamental rules of the game of the global market today, the floating exchange rate and the WTO rules, for example, those are favorable for the United States interests. If the floating rate exchange system for the US dollar is perfect, because whatever the value of the dollar, they don't have to take any decision. The other will pay. So it's a very good system for them. If you look at the WTO, it's also a very good system from the US perspective, because they can put pressure against countries which would resist import from the United States, for example. Saying, well, you don't respect the WTO rule. But when they are concerned, they do not respect the WTO rule, like the Western European, mostly an agricultural products. So the system, in a way, is very much biased in favor of the United States. Therefore, there is no incentive from within the United States to modify these rules. They will do whatever they can in order to sustain the rules which exist now. But the rules can be changed in a more balanced way by pressure from other countries. In the case of WTO, the system, the WTO rules make many victims. I'm not speaking only about agriculture. Many countries today in the world, for example in Africa, they cannot industrialize themselves and they cannot export agricultural products because it would go against the WTO rules. If a country today wanted to repeat what the Koreans did in the 50s and 60s, and Sakong-il knows a lot about this, subsidizing exports, giving favorable credit to certain companies so that they can penetrate foreign markets, selecting the winners, keeping your domestic market protected from competition. All this, which has been the successful strategy of Korea or Japan or Taiwan, all this is not possible today. It is forbidden by the WTO. So the WTO is quite a paradox. Supposedly it has created kind of a legal system, a field which is equal for all. It's okay if you're already in the field, but if you want to get into it, you can't. So this can change only if the emerging countries reunite and try to change the rule of the WTO. And it's the same in the financial system. which is favorable to the US, as I said before, it can only be changed by pressure from other countries, and the best pressure is to create alternative to the US dollars. If the euro becomes a credible and predictable currency in the future, or if in the future, if there is the equivalent of the euro in this part of Asia, then you will have a system which would be more balanced and which would be less dependent on the US will. So, to summarize, reforms will not come from the US, but it can come from external pressures.
Okay, now I think we have to let the Mr. Sorman go to Taipei after this meeting. Before we end, since this question was submitted by one of the students at Korea University, the question is, I think you partly answered this question, but his question is, in the future, if any country aspires to be a country like US today, which is dominant power, how could it foster those factors you mentioned, as is possible for any country to
I will just repeat the importance of higher learning. Once again, I will stress this. In the contemporary world, there is a definite premium on education, and most countries are behind the US in terms of higher education, and many countries do not understand or do not study very well why the US is dominant. And once again, it's dominant because they have chosen a free competitive system between universities. It's because there is free competition, because you can open university, because you can compete for students, professors, and so on, that you have an excellent system. If you have a centralized and bureaucratic system, you cannot go very far. And you have to remember, once again, that this costs money. But it's the best investment which can be made now in any emerging or mature nation.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we can take advantage of this rare opportunity here even further, but I think we have to end here. And as I said, he has to go to Taipei for his book, which is translated into Chinese in Taipei. And so for that occasion, he has to go there, and then he has to go back to New York, where he left his wife. Okay, please join me in again thanking